Well, what we bring today, my dear friends, are some examples from texts and from facts. And those examples are taken from the start of the history of Spiritism in France. And the intention is to help us to learn with the examples of other people in order to improve ourselves. That's our main goal in our life. So let's begin our talk today. Well, John Warren Monroe. John Warren Monroe, he is an associate professor of history at Iowa University, State University. And he wrote in his page this: the study of the past can be a highly disciplined way of learning to walk a mile in another person's shoes. By using a careful, rigorous study of evidence to reconstruct points of view, ways of life, and forms of common sense very different from our own, we move closer to the kind of clear-eyed understanding of others that a pluralistic society like ours requires. And he continues, a critical dialogue about the nature of our values and what should be changed if we hope to live up to them must begin with mutual understanding. And few things develop the skill of understanding more effectively than the study of history. Well, Professor Monroe, he is a collaborative researcher with Carlos Sete Bastos, this Brazilian spiritist and research of history of Spiritism. And Carlos Sete develops a reliable work of research on Spiritism history from primary sources. And he is the founder of this page on Facebook, CSI, Images and Historical Records of Spiritism, but unfortunately, we have it still now only in Portuguese, okay? And what happens today is that this type of research is now being possible because the official sources, the primary sources, as they call, the historians call them, such as birth certificate, wedding certificates, they, for example, just two, for example, those kind of documents, they are made available now through internet, what makes it easier to research. And here in this next slide, you can see a list of authors that wrote about Spiritism history and about Kardec. Of course, we are not covering all of them. It's just for you to have a visual idea. But what we can say is that until now, in order for us to learn about Spiritism history, we had to attain first to Allan Kardec's notes on his initiation to Spiritism that we find there in posthumous works and in the Spiritism Review, scattered throughout the Spiritism Review. And those are very simple information, though. However, at the same time, they are accessory to the, in relation to the scope and to the objectives of Kardec's doctrinal work. Another source that is the most used is a novel written by Canuto Abreu in 1957, which title is The Spirit's Book and Its Historical and Legendary Tradition. And as the very title says, this book, it combines in its narrative It mixes real traces of history, of the first times of Spiritism, together with legendary, with fictitious traits. So Canuto Abreu, he uses all the literary adornments that are a particular resource of this literary genre that he chose for his book, which is a novel combining history and fictitious information. Well, what happened is that other authors that wrote after Abreu, they based their work in Abreu's book. And that ended by crystallizing erroneous biographical data of Kardec, of the mediums, of the related people, about the events. And those errors, they echoed even in the movie Kardec that we watched from 2019. Of course, in the movie, we are aware to count those as poetic license, of course. And we could say also that whereas the historical information does not affect the doctrine itself, it can help our own confidence in it. And it can reinforce the traits of the people behind the doctrine, especially about Kardec, his good sense, his moral authority, coordinating the result of the work of various mediums. It was an upscale deed, we have to say. Also help us to see that the life's work of an idealist began even before Spiritism became Professor Rivail's goal and compass, in his life. The historical information also, it brings light to the mediums, to their traits, to their mediumship, and to other people that were around them, that were around Kardec, the companions, those who turned into deserters at some point, and the antagonists. But before we bring to the stage the details of some human beings of the dawn of Spiritism, let's remember very briefly what we read in Genesis, the last work written by Kardec, about the character of the Spiritist doctrine. And it's written there, in summary, that by its nature, the Spiritist revelation has a twofold character. It is at the same time a divine and a scientific revelation. It is divine in that its coming is providential and not the result of the initiative and premeditative design of man. It is scientific since its teaching is a privilege granted to no one individual, but it's given to all the world by the same means, that those who transmit and those who receive it are not passive beings, excused from the work of observation and research, that they are not called upon to abnegate their judgment and their free will, and that its control is not interdicted to themselves, but on the contrary, it's recommended. It is scientific also because it is deduced by the work of man, by the observation of facts and the instructions that the spirits give to them to compel them to study, to comment, to compare, until they arrive at a knowledge of the consequences and application. Well, and then in the next slide, I bring for us an example of this twofold character in the texts. And it's there in the book Posthumous Works, in the chapter My Mission in Spiritism. And when we see the dialogue between Kardec and the Spirit of Truth? Well, what happened is that Kardec was invited to the leading role of the setting of Spiritism. The Spirit of Truth confirms his mission, at the same time assures their assistance, and tells Kardec that he could use his free will to accept it or not. He even alerts Kardec of the struggles ahead. And he tells Kardec, do not forget that you can triumph as you can fail. In the latter case, another would replace you, since God's designs are not based on a man's head. Well, Kardec expresses his lack of talent and qualities for that leading position, and then he asks the assistance of the good spirits. But he accepts, and he says, if I'm destined to serve as an instrument for the purpose of providence, let me have it. Let it have me. But Kardec was a questioning guy. And he continues asking the Spirit of Truth, what could cause his failure? Okay. And the Spirit of Truth gives him this answer. You will stir up terrible hatreds against you. Fierce enemies will conjure up for your loss. You will find yourself grappling with malevolence, with slander and the very betrayal of those who will seem the most dedicated. Your best instructions will be despised and falsified. Kardec accepts everything without restriction and without preconceived idea. So in this text, besides being an example of the twofold character of our doctrine, we can also see here a man of firm will. Kardec consistently showed his firmness of character in his attitudes, in his reactions. He was always calm, he was always respectful, benevolent in the relations with everybody, with the mediums, with the deserters and antagonists, and with the spirits of all scopes. But at the same time, he was attentive to contradictions that could appear from the communications, that could appear in the medium's attitudes, because Kardec knew that a science does not survive with contradictions. So he endured a tiresome work, a tiresome task of always comparing, always analyzing, rejecting, and even pushing away mediums if needed. And he did likewise with the spirits themselves. He was firm, discussing their ideas and even correcting teachings of high scope spirits such as St. Louis, because for Kardec, names were irrelevant. Names of spirits were irrelevant. And we learned that in the Medium's book. Well, and as Kardec was told by the Spirit of Truth in this communication, he did face envy. He did face jealousy, but always with magnanimity. And we can see Kardec's generosity in his speech to the members of the Parisian Spiritist Society that he gave at the closing of the social year of 1858 and 1859. And he, at a certain point of his speech, he begins to talk about what was told to him, other societies that would supposedly wish to rival with the Parisian Spiritist Society. So he says, some say that one of them already counts on 300 members and that it has considerable financial resources. I want to believe it's not swaggering, so much not commendable to the spirits who may have given rise to that as to those who echoed it. If it is a reality, we sincerely congratulate them as long as it obtains the required unity of feelings to frustrate the influence of the bad spirits and consolidate its existence. I completely ignore the elements of the society or societies that they say are forming. I will only make a general observation. And he goes on in his speech congratulating those groups and gives them good advices as to be united with love, charity, and the assistance of the good spirits as a consequence. Continuing on Kardec's traits, I'd like to bring some biographical strokes, because when we putting together the information that is present in the Spiritist reviews, in posthumous works, and what we have in the books that were previously written, and what research nowadays keeps obtaining from the official documents, all of those, they stress Kardec's traits. And I would like to highlight some of them, a few, just a few. Well, Kardec was a tireless worker, and he was active to the very last moment. We know that he died of subtle death while packing some issues of the Spiritist Review to be distributed, the last issue under his hands. And what the research now, SATS research, has been proving as fact is that Kardec worked up to 20 hours a day, and he wrote 8,000 letters a year. And despite his hard work, we see Kardec always showing harmony of feelings. He was firm, he was resolute, but at the same time, he was respectful and benevolent in his attitudes, in his reactions. He was tolerant without ever abdicating his high ethical principles. Well, Kardec was interested in sciences and philosophy since his youth. And despite being born in 1804 in a family of distinguished judges and attorneys from both sides, Kardec chose to follow other paths, a different career. And he turned out into a progressive man, a free thinker. And here I open a parenthesis. There is no evidence of his staying at Yverdon, the Swiss educational establishment run by the pedagogue and educational reformer Pestalozzi. There is no official document still. They are really researching now. Carlos said together with Charles Kemp from the Spiritist movement in France. There is no official document still to prove that Kardec had been one of Pestalozzi's most eminent disciples. But what we do know is that he became an advocate of his system of education in France. By the way, let's remember Pestalozzi's motto for his revolutionary principles of education. Amazingly, learning by head, by hand, and heart. In addition, Kardec had always been in the field of education. He wrote many works that were essential to the reform of the educational system in France. One of Rivail's great concerns was the developing of teaching methods that would make the educational system more attractive and interesting to the students. So, when gathering this information, it calls our attention the fact that long before he became popular with the Spiritism under the pseudonym of Allan Kardec, Professor Rivaio was already a well-known name due to the diversity and the importance of his actions and works, written works, aiming to enlighten the masses. And he did it the rest of his life, enlightening the masses. Now let's jump to the years after 1851, when the Spiritist manifestations fever became the object of curiosity and entertainment in Paris salons. But Kardec was a skeptic at first about those. He put on his researcher glasses and analyzed the phenomena meticulously. And he brought to the order of the natural phenomena what was called supernatural, superstition, marvelous, magical. And the knowledge he got would shed light to an immensity of facts and problems considered insoluble to them. And the Spirit's book, released in 1857, in a few years, called the interest of numerous people of all classes, from workers to scholars. Why that? Because Kardec was able to create a text that was easy to read with logic argumentation to create conviction and debunk refutation. In that book, people could find the material proof of existence of the soul to oppose the materialistic and pantheistic ideas, could find the answer to the philosophical doubts of humankind, who we are, where we go after the death of the body, what for are we on earth, and also in that book, there was and there is the foundations to universal equality, fraternity, and solidarity. And the next slide, I will bring an example in the texts about Kardec ethical principles. And he wrote in the introduction to the Spiritist Review in 1858, at the month of the release of the Spiritist Review, he wrote this: nevertheless, as our aim is to get to the truth, we will welcome all observations directed to us, and as much as allowed by the acquired knowledge, we will try to resolve the doubts and clarify the still obscure points. Our review will thus be a tribune where the discussion will never distance itself from the standards of the strictest conveniences. In one word, we will discuss, but we will not dispute. Language inconveniences have never been good arguments to the eyes of wise people. It is the weapon of those who do not have something better to offer and which turn against those who use it. Well, the Spiritist Review, by the way, in those issues that lasted since 1858 under Kardec until his death in 1869, we find the development of Spiritism in the first 10 years. The magazines, they register the activities of the Parisian Spiritist Society of Studies, Spiritist Studies. There, Kardec discusses all kinds of subjects, all kinds of world events at the light of Spiritism. And he informs about Spiritism. He informs about the Spiritist societies, about mediumship everywhere. So we can say that the Spiritist Review is a magnificent work of documentation of the meetings of the Parisian Society. It portrays Kardec's surgical questioning the spirits, Kardec's debates with the detractors, with the antagonists, materialists and religious people. And there we also find, and a good thing for us, Spiritist groups, we also find the bylaws, the regulations of the society, the criteria for participants in the Parisian Spiritist Society. So historians, they do use the Spiritist Review to get to know the functions of the Parisian society, as well as the development of Spiritism in its early 10 years, and about Kardec, his struggles, his victories. So talking about the Parisian Spiritist Society, let's see a bit about Kardec and the mediums in the Parisian Spiritist Society. Well, the society was founded some months after the Spiritist Review in April the same year, 1858. And we can say that it was the first Spiritist society, and it had the sole purpose of studying everything that could foster the progress of the new doctrine. We can say that it was the laboratory of mediumship, and there, in the Parisian society, paraded a diversity of mediums and mediumships, a diversity of spirits too, spirits of known and unknown personalities to our human society, spirits of recent and long time death. And it was the Parisian society, the focal point, the hub of world spiritist activity in those 10 first years. And the next slide I copied from the CSI Facebook page. It is a timeline of the Parisian society, but he goes 2 years before, and it shows us that from 1856 to 1869, Kardec worked directly with more than 30 mediums. Indirectly, during those 12 years that followed the boom of the Spiritist book publication, they say those were thousands of mediums. And now I will bring for us a few facts, also texts about the 2 first mediums that Kardec worked with, Caroline Baudin and Pélagie Baudin. Well, the Baudin sisters. The Baudin sisters are among the first mediums that Allan Kardec worked with. It was by attending the weekly mediumistic sessions held at the residence of the Baudin family that Kardec seriously began his research on Spiritist phenomena, which result in the Spiritist doctrine. Well, the sessions with them lasted between 1855 and 1857, when each of them, after marrying, by the way, on the same day, they went to live in different places from the rest of the family. So they were not in Paris anymore from 1857. Well, Carlos Sett's research, he brings us lots of biographical information about them, about their family, everything. It's very interesting to go there to CSI page. And also, his research clears wrong information. For example, the name of the youngest Baudin. We know her by Julie since now, but her real name was Pélagie Baudin. But the most striking misconception that came in Carlos Sett's research was about their age. Caroline and Pelagie, they were not little girls. The historical sources, they prove us that Caroline was already 30 years old, and the youngest, Pelagie, 27 years old in 1857. So we that knew differently, we need to overcome that idea that the two mediums were little girls, very young, very naive, okay? And by the way, about this information, these biographical mismatches that put Caroline and her sister respectively at the ages of 18 and 16 at the time of the release of the Spirits book, those are details that are present in Abreu's book and were echoed by the biographers that came after him. So now let's bring some characteristics of the mediumship of the Bodin sisters. Well, there is no information about the beginning of the Bodin sisters' mediumistic activities. We know that in 1855, when they met Professor Rivaio, they already had their mediumistic skills well developed, and the Bodin family had been carrying weekly evocation sessions for a while. Well, Kardec, however, once described the characteristics of the mediumistic activity of one of the Bodins, in this case, Caroline. But, and we can say that her mediumistic characteristics may not differ much from her sister's ability, from Pelagie's ability. So Kardec wrote that during the year of 1856, the experiments with the Spiritist manifestations held in Mr. B. Bodin house at Rue Lamartine attracted a select and large crowd of people. The communicating spirits in that circle were more or less serious. Some have said things of remarkable wisdom, of notable depth, as one can judge from the Spirit's book that was initiated and in its most part accomplished there. Others were less serious. Their cheerful humor was given to jester, but fine and never inconvenient jester. And he continues, among those spirits was Frederic Soulier, who came on his own unsolicited, but whose unexpected visits were always an enjoyable pastime to everyone. His conversation was witty, fine, vivacious, opportune, having never denied the author of the Memoirs du Diable. He had been a writer when incarnated. As a matter of fact, he never attributed importance to himself, and when inquired about complex philosophical issues, he frankly confessed his insufficiency to solve them, saying that he was still too much attached to matter and that he preferred the funny things to the serious ones. The medium who served him as interpreter was Mrs. Caroline B. Bodin, one of the daughters of the owner of the house, a medium of exclusively passive kind, who had no consciousness about what she wrote, being able to talk and laugh her head off, what she used to do with pleasure, while her hand jotted the words on the paper. The mechanical means used for a long time was the planchette with a pencil, described in the medium's book. Later, the medium used the direct psychography. Soulier's identity was confirmed by 1,001 details that cannot escape a careful examination. On several occasions, he left his signature, which was confronted with the original. One day, someone asked for his picture. Therefore, the medium that could not draw and had never seen him made a sketch of impressive similarity. And when Kardec wrote the preface to the tale A Forgotten Night that was dictated by Soulier through Caroline, he wrote about the quality of the result. We do not take it, the tale, as a highly philosophical piece of work, but as an original sample of the hard work obtained from the spirits. It is remarkable how everything is articulated, connected through an impressive art. The most extraordinary is the fact that the theme was resumed over 5 or 6 different occasions, and sometimes after breaks of 2 or 3 weeks. Well, on every restart, the subject continued as if written at once, without any obliterations, reticence, or the need to recover what had been said before. We published it as it came out from the medium's writings, without changing anything, neither the style, nor the ideas, or the connection of the facts. And the next line is a respite for us. Such a beautiful picture. It was taken in 1866 from the Rue Lamartine, which was the second address of the Baudin family. And I was wondering and imagine Kardec striding those cobblestones 10 years before, just 10 years before, going to the weekly sessions at the Baudin's family. And the view of this was taken from another street, from the intersection of the Rue Notre-Dame de la Lorette. Okay. And it was the second address of the family, by the way. The first address, when Kardec began with them, was the street Rochechouart. Now let's see something about the meetings. And in posthumous works, Kardec writes that there were quite a number of these meetings, and he was talking about the Baudin's evocation sessions. In addition to the regulars, everyone who requested permission to attend them was admitted. The mediums were the 2 Baudin young ladies who wrote on a slate with the help of a basket called carapeta, and which is described in the medium's book. This process, which requires the help of 2 people, excludes any possibility of interference of the medium's ideas. Then I had the opportunity to see continuous communications and answers to questions, sometimes even mental questions, which in an evident manner demonstrated the intervention of a strange intelligence. Well, the meetings at the Baudin's residence, they dealt with mundane and frivolous things, such as all other meetings in those times, first times, in Paris salons. And the character of the spirit Zephyr was also mundane and frivolous. And Zephyr manifested there in those meetings frequently and claimed to be the protector of the Baudin family. Well, Kardec noted that Zephyr was not of great elevation, spiritually wise, but it was good and sympathetic towards Kardec. So much so that, aided by the superior spirits, he helped Kardec in his research. Well, but the presence of Professor Revile in those mundane and frivolous meetings changed their character, gave a new character to those meetings. And Kardec writes about that. Kardec tells us that I tried to get there the solution of the problems that interested me from the point of view of philosophy, psychology, and the nature of the invisible world. I took a series of prepared and methodically arranged questions for each session. They were always answered with precision, depth, and logic. From then on, the sessions took on a very different character. Among the assistants, there were serious people who took a keen interest in them. And if I happened to be absent, they did not know what to do. For the most, the futile questions had lost all appeal. I, at first, only cared about educating myself. Later, when I saw that it constituted a set and gained the proportions of a doctrine, I had the idea of publishing the received teachings for the instruction of all people. It was those same questions that successfully developed and completed form the basis of the Spirit's book. Well, Kardec's participation in the sessions with the Bodhans continued for the next 2 years, 1856 and 1857, but although not exclusively then, because from 1856 on, he began to attend the meetings at the circle of Mr. Rustans, the magnetizer, and Mrs. Jaffé, the medium. And a year later, in 1857, he would publish the Spirit's book. And in the same year, in the end of 1857, he would record the Bodhan's whereabouts in the Spiritist Review. And he writes there, towards the end of that same year, the two Mrs. Bodhan got married. The meetings stopped and the family dispersed. But by then, my relations started to expand and the spirits multiplied my means of instruction in view of my next works. Well, and I would end now saying that what our wish today with these texts and these facts, bringing these few pieces of information that we extracted from the Spiritism texts and the historical documents about Kardec and the Bodhans. Our hope is that they can help us to deepen our understanding of the individuals behind the doctrine, and at the same time, reinforce our confidence in the doctrine as a very special compass for our spiritual journey. So many anonymous texts that are scattered in the 23 fundamental works written by Kardec that came to us through the two sisters' mediumship. So much so that we could easily say that we must have the Bodhan sisters in the account of the great contributors to Spiritism. They were the transmitters of important spiritual teachings, and they lend their mediumship to noble entities and to a noble work, such as the Spirit of Truth. And one thing, if we could just pinpoint one detail that we could model from them, is their example of selflessness in the exercise of their psychic faculties in favor of a spiritual research conducted by Allan Kardec and the high spirits, all of them under the mastering of the Spirit of Truth. And here I end, thanking you all for putting up with me. And you would never thank enough Carlos Sete Bastos for his historical research and other researchers nowadays that are doing a marvelous work. And also, we would also never thank enough Cosme Mas for making available for us Kardecpedia and creating IDEAC for helping us with material to make it easier for us to study Spiritism and to understand it better for our own benefit in our lives as immortal spirits. Thank you all.